Himes Rodriguez had just finished the longest shift of his week, mopping floors at the prestigious Meridian Tower downtown. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his back ached from hours of bending over, and all he wanted was to get home to his 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. But as he walked through the parking garage toward the bus stop, something caught his eye: a leather wallet lying near the wheel of a gleaming black Bentley. He didn't know this wallet belonged to one of the city's most powerful billionaires. He didn't know that inside was a photograph that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his late wife, Maria. He didn't know this single act of honesty would unlock secrets buried for over a decade, secrets that could either destroy his family or give them the future he'd only dreamed of. The question was, when Alexander Grant opened that wallet and saw what was inside, would James be ready for the truth that was about to change everything? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. James bent down and picked up the wallet, feeling its expensive leather between his calloused fingers. The weight of it told him it wasn't empty. His first instinct was to look around. Maybe the owner was nearby, but the parking garage was deserted at this late hour. Most of the office workers had left hours ago, and the cleaning crew was finishing up their routes. James worked the night shift because it paid slightly more, and every extra dollar mattered when you were raising a daughter alone on a janitor's salary. He opened the wallet carefully, checking for identification. The driver's license made his eyes widen. Alexander Grant, age 42, address in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. James had heard that name before. Everyone had. Grant Industries was responsible for half the skyscrapers downtown, and Alexander Grant was frequently mentioned in business magazines as one of the youngest billionaires in the country. The wallet contained several credit cards, all black and platinum, the kind James had only seen in movies. There was also a thick stack of cash, more money than James made in 2 months. For a moment, James stood there in the fluorescent lighting of the parking garage, holding more wealth in his hands than he'd ever touched. He thought about Sophia, how she'd grown out of her school shoes again, how the refrigerator at home was nearly empty, how the rent was due in 3 days, and he was still $50 short. It would be so easy to take the cash and throw the wallet in a dumpster somewhere. Who would know? Rich people probably lost money all the time and didn't even notice. But then he thought about Maria, his late wife, and what she would say if she could see him now. Maria had always been the moral compass in their relationship, the one who insisted they return extra change when cashiers made mistakes, who taught Sophia that honesty was more important than comfort. Maria had died 2 years ago from cancer, leaving James to raise their daughter alone. But her voice still guided him in moments like these. James closed the wallet and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He would return it first thing tomorrow morning. It was the right thing to do, even if it meant another night of stretching leftover pasta to feed them both dinner. The bus ride home was longer than usual, delayed by late-night construction. James dozed fitfully, his head bumping against the window as the city lights blurred past. He thought about the photograph he'd glimpsed while looking through the wallet for identification. It had been tucked behind the driver's license, a small, faded picture of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. Something about her had seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. Probably just one of those faces that reminded you of someone else. James's apartment was in a neighborhood that real estate agents politely called transitional. The buildings were old, the stairs creaked, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' conversations. But it was home, and more importantly, it was one he could afford. Sophia was already asleep when he got in, her homework spread across the kitchen table where she'd been working, when exhaustion finally claimed her. He covered her with a blanket and moved her papers aside, then sat down with a cup of instant coffee to think about tomorrow. Returning the wallet wouldn't be simple. He couldn't just walk into the lobby of Grant Industries and ask to see the CEO. There would be security guards, receptionists, layers of protection between Alexander Grant and the outside world. But James had worked in enough office buildings to know how these places operated. He would find a way. The next morning, James dropped Sophia off at school and took 2 buses to reach the downtown financial district. Grant Industries occupied the top 15 floors of one of the city's most impressive towers. its logo gleaming in gold letters across the lobby entrance. James had cleaned this building before, though never the executive floors. Those were handled by specialized firms that charged premium rates for discretion and security clearances. The lobby was intimidating, all marble and steel with a ceiling that soared 3 stories high. Well-dressed people moved purposefully across the polished floors, speaking into wireless earpieces or tapping on tablets. James felt out of place in his second-hand jacket and worn shoes, but he approached the security desk anyway. "I need to return something to Alexander Grant," he said to the guard, a large man whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide his military bearing. The guard looked James up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Mr. Grant doesn't take unsolicited meetings. If you have business with Grant Industries, you'll need to go through proper channels." "It's not business," James insisted, pulling out the wallet. "I found this in a parking garage last night. It belongs to him." The guard's expression changed when he saw the wallet, recognizing it immediately. "I'll need to see some identification," he said, suddenly more professional. James handed over his driver's license and waited while the guard made several phone calls, speaking in low tones that James couldn't quite catch. After 10 minutes, the guard handed back James's license along with a temporary visitor's badge. 37th floor, the guard said. "Someone will meet you at the elevator." The elevator ride seemed to last forever, each floor marked by a soft chime that counted off James's rising anxiety. He'd never been this high in a building before, never moved in circles where people had personal assistants and corner offices. By the time the doors opened on the 37th floor, his palms were sweating. A woman in her 30s was waiting for him, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her smile polite but distant. "Mr. Rodriguez? I'm Catherine Wells, Mr. Grant's executive assistant. Thank you so much for coming in." She led him through a maze of corridors lined with expensive artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. Other employees they passed looked up with curiosity, probably wondering what someone like James was doing on the executive floor. "Mr. Grant is in his office," Catherine said as they approached a set of heavy wooden doors. "He's very grateful that you took the time to return his wallet personally." She knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response. The office beyond was enormous, larger than James's entire apartment, with one wall that was entirely glass overlooking the harbor. Alexander Grant stood behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, his back to the door as he stared out at the water. "Mr. Rodriguez is here, sir," Catherine announced. Alexander Grant turned around, and James got his first good look at the billionaire in person. He was tall and lean, with silver threads running through his dark hair, and the kind of tan that came from sailing yachts rather than working construction sites. His suit probably cost more than James made in 6 months, but there was something approachable about his face, a warmth in his eyes that seemed genuine. "Mr. Rodriguez," Alexander said, crossing the office with his hand extended. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. Please, have a seat." James shook his hand, surprised by the firm grip and the calluses he felt there. Rich people weren't supposed to have working hands. He settled into one of the leather chairs facing the desk, feeling small and out of place. "I have to ask," Alexander continued, returning to his chair, "where exactly did you find it?" "I've been retracing my steps since yesterday morning. In the parking garage at Meridian Tower," James replied. "Near a black Bentley. I was finishing my shift there. I worked the night cleaning crew." Alexander nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. "That makes sense. I had a late meeting there Tuesday night. Must have fallen out of my pocket when I was getting in the car." He paused, studying James's face. "You could have just turned it in to building security, you know. Most people would have." James shrugged uncomfortably. "Seemed like the right thing to do was return it personally. Make sure it got back to you." "Well, I'm grateful." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "Please, let me give you a reward for your honesty." "That's not necessary," James said quickly, though part of him wanted to accept whatever Alexander was offering. "I didn't do it for money." "I insist," Alexander replied, already writing. "What you did was remarkable. In my experience, Most people would have been tempted by what was in that wallet. James watched Alexander write, wondering how much money someone like him considered appropriate for returning a wallet. Probably more than James saw in a month. But before he could protest again, Alexander had torn off the check and was handing it across the desk. James looked at the amount and felt his breath catch. $5,000. It was more money than he'd ever held at one time. Enough to pay rent for months, enough to buy Sophia new clothes and shoes, enough to fix the dozen little problems in their apartment that he'd been putting off because he couldn't afford repairs. "Mr. Grant, this is too much," he said, though his fingers closed around the check involuntarily. "Nonsense," Alexander replied. "Honesty like yours is rare in this world. You deserve to be rewarded for it." Alexander took the wallet from James and opened it, checking that everything was still inside. James watched him flip through the credit cards and count the cash, all of it still there. Then Alexander paused, his expression changing as he reached the photograph tucked behind his license. James saw the exact moment when recognition hit. Alexander's face went pale, his hands beginning to tremble as he stared at the faded picture. For several seconds, the office was completely silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below. "Where did you get this?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get what?" James was confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. Alexander held up the photograph, and James could see it clearly now. It was the same picture he'd noticed the night before, the young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. But now, seeing it in the light of Alexander's office, James felt his own blood run cold. It was Maria. A younger Maria, probably in her early 20s, but unmistakably his late wife. She was wearing a sundress James had never seen, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize, but her face was exactly as he remembered from their wedding photos. "That's my wife," James said slowly. "My late wife, Maria. But I don't understand. Why do you have her picture?" Alexander stared at him for a long moment, then back at the photograph. "Maria Rodriguez?" "Maria Santos, before we were married," James corrected automatically. "But yes, that's her. She died 2 years ago." Alexander sank back in his chair as if he'd been punched. He continued staring at the photograph, his face cycling through emotions James couldn't read. Shock, confusion, something that might have been grief. "I need you to tell me about her," Alexander said finally. "Everything. How you met, when you married, about her family." "I don't understand," James repeated. "Why do you have that picture? How do you know Maria?" "Please," Alexander said, and there was something raw in his voice now, all the professional composure stripped away. "Just tell me about her first, then I'll explain everything." James felt like the office was spinning around him. Nothing about this encounter was going the way he'd expected. He'd come here to return a wallet and collect maybe a small reward. Instead, he was sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the city, looking at a photograph of his dead wife. "We met at a community college," James began hesitantly. "I was taking night classes, trying to get my maintenance certification. She was studying to be a teacher. We were both working during the day, struggling to make ends meet. But we found each other in the library one night, when we were both too tired to study anymore." Alexander listened intently, never taking his eyes off James's face. "She was beautiful," James continued, warming to the subject despite his confusion. "But it wasn't just that. She was kind, you know. She tutored kids for free, volunteered at the food bank, always trying to help people who had even less than we did. When we got married, we were so broke, we had the reception in her sister's backyard, but it was perfect, because we had each other." "What about her family?" Alexander asked. "Her parents?" "She didn't like to talk about them much," James said. "Her father died when she was young, and her relationship with her mother was complicated. Maria said her mother had wanted a different life for her, had plans that didn't include marrying a maintenance worker and staying in the same neighborhood where she grew up." Alexander nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Did she ever mention anyone named Alex? Or Alexander?" James thought carefully. "Not that I remember. Why?" "Mr. Grant, you're scaring me here," How do you know my wife? Alexander stood up and walked to the window, still holding the photograph. For several minutes, he stood there in silence, looking out at the city below. When he turned back to face James, his expression was grave. 20 years ago, Alexander said, I was a different person. I was 22, fresh out of college, working at my first job at an investment firm downtown. I was arrogant, convinced I was going to conquer the world, certain that money and success were the only things that mattered. James waited, sensing that Alexander was building up to something important. I met a girl that summer, Alexander continued. She was working as a waitress at a coffee shop near my office. She was beautiful, intelligent, full of dreams about becoming a teacher, about helping kids in underserved communities. Her name was Maria Santos. The words hit James like a physical blow. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what Alexander was telling him. We dated for almost a year, Alexander went on. I was completely in love with her, and I thought she felt the same way. But my family, my father especially, had very different ideas about who I should be with. They wanted someone from our social circle, someone who understood the responsibilities that came with wealth and position. What happened? James asked. Though he wasn't sure, he wanted to know the answer. My father made me an offer I was too young and stupid to refuse, Alexander said bitterly. He promised me a position running one of his subsidiary companies, promised to fast-track my career, but only if I ended things with Maria. He said she would never fit into our world, that she would hold me back from my potential. Alexander returned to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. I chose money over love, he said simply. I broke up with Maria without explaining why, told her I was moving to New York for work and that long-distance relationships never worked out. It was cowardly and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since. James felt like he was hearing about a completely different person than the Maria he had known and loved. His wife had never mentioned dating anyone seriously before him, had always said he was her first real love. She never told me about you, James said quietly. I'm not surprised, Alexander replied. I hurt her badly. The last thing she said to me was that she never wanted to see me again, that she was going to build a life with someone who actually deserved her love. The office fell silent again. James stared at the photograph in Alexander's hands, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew about his marriage. Why do you still have her picture? He asked finally. Alexander looked down at the photograph with an expression of infinite sadness. Because I never stopped loving her. Because I realized too late that I'd given up the best thing that ever happened to me for money and status. That ultimately meant nothing. I kept this picture to remind myself of the biggest mistake I ever made. You could have found her, James pointed out. You have resources, connections. If you really wanted to, you could have tracked her down years ago. I tried, Alexander admitted. About 10 years ago, I hired a private investigator. But by then she was married to you, had started a family. She looked happy in the photographs he showed me. What right did I have to disrupt that? She'd moved on, built the life she deserved with someone who appreciated her from the beginning. James felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at Alexander for hurting Maria, sadness for the pain his wife must have carried, confusion about why she'd never shared this part of her past. But underneath it all was a growing understanding of something else. The cancer treatments, James said suddenly. What about them? Alexander asked. The experimental treatment in Switzerland. Maria's insurance wouldn't cover it, and we couldn't afford it on our own. The doctors said it might have given her another few years, but it cost $200,000. Alexander's face went very still. James, I need you to listen to me carefully. If I had known Maria was sick, if I had known she needed help, I would have paid for any treatment in the world. Money has never been an object for me, and her happiness, her life, was worth more than anything I own. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of missed opportunities and what might have beens. James found himself imagining an alternate reality where Maria had lived, where their daughter still had her mother, where the past 2 years hadn't been an endless struggle to keep their heads above water. She was proud, James said finally. Even if she had known you wanted to help, she probably wouldn't have accepted it. Maria always insisted on making her own way in the world. That sounds like her, Alexander said with a sad smile. She was always independent, always determined to succeed on her own terms. James stood up abruptly, needing to move, to process what he'd learned. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, seeing it differently now. Somewhere down there was the coffee shop where Maria had worked 20 years ago, where she'd met this man who still carried her photograph. Somewhere down there was the community college where she'd met James himself, where she'd started the life that led to their marriage and Sophia's birth. I need to ask you something, James said without turning around. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Are you telling me this because you want something? Because now that Maria's gone, you think you can somehow make up for the past by helping me and Sophia? It was a fair question, and Alexander took his time considering his answer. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth, he said finally. Because keeping secrets about someone you loved isn't fair to their memory. As for wanting something, yes, I suppose I do. I want to help you and your daughter, not because I think it will absolve me of my past mistakes, but because Maria would have wanted Sophia to have every opportunity in the world. James turned back to face him. What kind of help? Whatever kind you'll accept, Alexander said. Sophia's education, for starters. I looked into your background after you left yesterday, James. I know you're working 3 part-time jobs just to keep up with rent and basic expenses. I know Sophia is a brilliant student who deserves better than the underfunded schools in your neighborhood. The mention of his daughter made James's protective instincts flare. Sophia's doing fine where she is. I'm sure she is, Alexander said carefully. But imagine what she could accomplish with access to better resources. Private tutors, advanced programs, eventually the best universities in the country. Maria always wanted to help kids reach their potential. Wouldn't she want the same for her own daughter? It was a compelling argument, and James felt his resistance beginning to weaken. He thought about Sophia doing homework at the kitchen table every night, struggling with math problems because he couldn't afford to buy her the textbooks her classmates had. He thought about the college fund he'd been trying to build, adding $20 here and $50 there, whatever he could. Spare it, knowing it would never be enough to pay for the education Sophia deserved. What would you want in return? James asked suspiciously. Nothing, Alexander said. Well, that's not entirely true. I'd want to get to know Sophia, if you'd allow it. Not as a replacement father, but as someone who cared about her mother and wants to see her thrive. And maybe, if you're willing, I'd like to hear more stories about Maria, about the life she built after I was foolish enough to let her go. James found himself studying Alexander's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but all he saw was genuine regret and a desperate desire to make amends for past mistakes. This is a lot to process, James said finally. I understand, Alexander replied. Take all the time you need. But James, I want you to know something else. The job you're doing, working 3 positions just to provide for your daughter, that's exactly the kind of man Maria would have chosen. She always said she wanted someone who would put family first, who understood that love was more important than money. You gave her something I never could have. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only added to James's emotional turmoil. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads, with one path leading back to his familiar struggles, and another leading into unknown territory that could either transform their lives or destroy everything he'd worked to build. I need to pick up Sophia from school, James said, checking his watch. And I need time to think about all of this. Of course, Alexander said, standing up. But before you go, please take this. He held out a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Call me anytime, day or night. And James, whatever you decide about my offer to help, I want you to keep that check. You've earned it. James looked down at the $5,000 check still in his hand, money that could solve so many of their immediate problems. Part of him wanted to tear it up, to walk away from Alexander Grant and everything he represented. But the practical part of his mind, the part that worried about Sophia's future every night before falling asleep, wouldn't let him. Thank you, he said quietly, pocketing both the check and the business card. Alexander walked him to the door personally, an unusual gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the employees they passed. James, he said as they reached the elevator, I know this is overwhelming, but I hope you'll consider letting me be part of Sophia's life, even in a small way. I missed my chance with Maria, but maybe I can still honor her memory by helping her daughter. The elevator arrived, and James stepped inside. As the doors began to close, Alexander spoke one more time. She talked about having children someday, he said. About being the kind of mother who would do anything for her kids. From what I can see, Sophia got exactly the parents she deserved. The doors closed, and James was alone with his thoughts as the elevator descended 37 floors. By the time he reached the lobby, he had made his first decision. He would cash the check, but only after telling Sophia about her mother's past and giving her a chance to understand where the money had come from. The bus ride to Sophia's school gave James time to figure out how to explain the morning's revelations to an 8-year-old. How do you tell a child that her deceased mother once dated a billionaire? How do you explain that this stranger wanted to become part of their lives out of guilt and regret over choices made 20 years ago? Sophia was waiting for him at the school's pickup area, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her dark hair pulled back in the same style Maria used to wear. She had her mother's eyes, warm and intelligent, and her mother's smile, bright enough to light up a room. "Daddy, you're early," she said, climbing into the passenger seat of his beat-up Honda. "I had some business downtown," James replied, starting the engine. "How was school?" "Mrs. Peterson says I might be able to skip ahead in math next year," Sophia said proudly. "She thinks I'm ready for algebra." James smiled, feeling a familiar surge of pride in his daughter's abilities. Sophia had inherited Maria's intelligence along with her appearance, and she approached learning with the same enthusiasm her mother had shown for Bao. "Teaching. That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said. "Your mom would be so proud." They drove home in comfortable silence, Sophia working on homework in the passenger seat while James navigated the afternoon traffic. But his mind wasn't on driving. It was on the conversation he needed to have with his daughter and the decision that would affect both of their futures. Their apartment building looked more run-down than usual after spending the morning in Alexander Grant's gleaming office tower. James noticed the peeling paint on the front steps, the broken mailbox that had been that way for months, the graffiti that appeared faster than the landlord could paint over it. This was the world Sophia was growing up in, and while James had tried to make it as stable and loving as possible, he couldn't ignore the limitations it imposed on her opportunities. "Sophia," he said as they climbed the stairs to their third-floor apartment, "when we get inside, I need to talk to you about something important." "Am I in trouble?" she asked, immediately worried. "No, baby, nothing like that," James assured her. "It's about your mom, actually, about something from before you were born." They settled at the kitchen table where Sophia did her homework every evening, and James tried to find the words to explain the morning's revelations. He told her about finding the wallet, about returning it to Alexander Grant, about discovering the photograph of Maria. He left out some of the more complicated emotional details, but he tried to be honest about the basic facts. Sophia listened with the serious expression she wore when processing difficult information, asking occasional questions, but mostly just absorbing what her father was telling her. "So, Mom knew him before she met you," Sophia said when James finished. "And he still has her picture because he missed her." "That's right," James confirmed, impressed by his daughter's ability to grasp the situation. "And now he wants to help us because he feels bad about making Mom sad?" "Something like that, yes." Sophia was quiet for several minutes, staring at the homework spread across the table. Finally, she looked up at her father with Maria's intelligent eyes. "What do you think Mom would want us to do?" she asked. It was exactly the right question, and exactly the one James had been asking himself all afternoon. "I think," he said carefully, "that your mom would want us to do whatever is best for you. She always said you were the most important thing in the world to her. Do you trust him?" Sophia asked. "This Alexander man?" James considered the question seriously. "I think I'm starting to," he admitted. He seemed genuinely sorry about the past, and he didn't have to tell me the truth about knowing your mom. He could have just thanked me for the wallet and sent me on my way. "Can we meet him?" Quote, Sophia asked. "I want to hear more about what Mom was like when she was young." The request surprised James, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Sophia had been only 6 when Maria died, and her memories of her mother were already beginning to fade around the edges. The idea of talking to someone who had known Maria as a young woman might be appealing to a daughter hungry for connections to her deceased parent. "If that's what you want," James said. "But Sophia, I need you to understand that this man is very wealthy and powerful. If we let him into our lives, things might change in ways we can't predict. Will we still be a family?" Sophia asked, getting to the heart of her concern. "Always," James promised, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "No matter what happens, no matter who else might be part of our lives, we'll always be a family first." That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, James sat at the kitchen table with Alexander's business card in front of him. The apartment was quiet, except for the usual sounds filtering through the thin walls, television shows and conversations from neighboring units, the occasional siren from the street below. James thought about Maria, about the young woman she'd been when she met Alexander Grant, about the life she might have had if things had worked out differently. He thought about the life she had chosen instead, the struggles and joys of their marriage, the way she'd approached single motherhood with such determination after her diagnosis. Most of all, he thought about what Maria would want for Sophia. She'd always been fiercely protective of their daughter's potential, always pushing Sophia to work hard in school, always talking about college and careers and opportunities. Maria had grown up with limited options and had been determined that Sophia would have choices she'd never had. James picked up his phone and dialed the number on the business card. Alexander answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "James," he said, recognizing the number. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you so soon." "I talked to Sophia," James said. "She wants to meet you. She wants to hear stories about her mom." "I'd be honored," Alexander replied, and James could hear the emotion in his voice. "When would be convenient? This weekend maybe? Saturday afternoon? You could come here, meet Sophia in her own environment." There was a pause, and James wondered if Alexander was having second thoughts about visiting their rundown neighborhood. "I'd like that very much," Alexander said finally. "And James, thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance." After hanging up, James walked to Sophia's bedroom and stood in the doorway, watching his daughter sleep. She looked so much like Maria in the dim light from the hallway, and James found himself wondering what his wife would think about the day's developments. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of bright autumn weather that made the city look almost beautiful, even in James's neighborhood. He and Sophia spent the morning cleaning their small apartment and preparing for Alexander's visit. James was nervous, seeing their home through the eyes of someone accustomed to luxury, but Sophia seemed genuinely excited about meeting someone who had known her mother. Alexander arrived precisely on time, carrying a bouquet of flowers and looking slightly out of place in his expensive casual clothes. But when Sophia answered the door, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "You must be Sophia," he said, crouching down to her level. "I can see your mother in your face. You're beautiful, just like she was." Sophia smiled shyly, but accepted the compliment graciously. She led Alexander into their small living room, chattering about school and her friends with the easy confidence children show when they feel safe. James watched the interaction carefully, looking for any signs that Alexander was patronizing or uncomfortable, but the billionaire seemed genuinely interested in Sophia's stories, asking questions about her favorite subjects and listening intently to her answers. "Your dad tells me you're very good at math," Alexander said as they settled on the couch. "I like solving problems," Sophia replied. "Mom always said math was like a puzzle, and I love puzzles." She was right about that, Alexander agreed. "Did you know your mother was one of the smartest people I ever met? She could figure out solutions to problems that stumped everyone else." For the next hour, Alexander shared stories about the young Maria that James had never heard. He told them about her volunteer work at a literacy center, about her plans to revolutionize education in underserved communities, about her infectious optimism and her belief that everyone deserved a chance to succeed. She had this way of making you believe you could do anything, Alexander said, his eyes distant with memory. When I was with her, I felt like I could change the world. Why didn't you marry her? Sophia asked with the directness that only children can manage. Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because I was young and foolish, he said finally. I thought other things were more important than love. I was wrong. But then she married my daddy, Sophia pointed out, and they had me. So maybe it worked out the way it was supposed to. The simple wisdom of the statement made both men smile. James felt a surge of pride in his daughter's emotional intelligence, her ability to find the positive in difficult situations. I think you're absolutely right, Alexander said. Your mom got exactly the family she deserved. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself relaxing despite his initial reservations. Alexander was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about their daily lives and sharing stories that revealed more about Maria's personality than James had learned in all their years of marriage. It wasn't that Maria had been secretive, but rather that she'd been focused on building their life together rather than dwelling on the past. When it came time for Alexander to leave, Sophia hugged him goodbye with the same warmth she showed her favorite teachers. Will you come back? She asked. If your father says it's okay, Alexander replied, looking questioningly at James. You're welcome anytime, James said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed full of excitement about her mother's mysterious past, James and Alexander sat on the building's front steps, sharing a beer and talking about the future. She's remarkable, Alexander said, referring to Sophia. Maria would be so proud of the job you've done raising her. I worry I'm not enough, James admitted. I work as hard as I can, but there's only so much I can provide on a janitor's salary. She deserves so much more. You're more than enough, Alexander said firmly. Love and stability are worth more than money. But James, I meant what I said about helping with her education. There are programs, schools, opportunities that could help her reach her full potential. They talked about possibilities, about private schools and tutoring programs, about college funds and internship opportunities. Alexander painted a picture of a future where Sophia could pursue any dream, where financial limitations wouldn't constrain her choices. Why are you really doing this? James asked as their conversation wound down. And please, be completely honest. Alexander was quiet for a long time, staring out at the street where a few teenagers were playing basketball under a broken streetlight. 20 years ago, he said finally, I made a choice that haunted me every day since. I chose wealth and status over love, and I've spent the last 2 decades wondering what my life would have been like if I'd been brave enough to choose differently. I can't change the past, but maybe I can honor Maria's memory by helping her daughter become everything she was meant to be. End quote. Alexander turned to look directly at James. I'm not trying to replace you as Sophia's father, and I'm not trying to buy my way into her life. I'm trying to do what Maria would have wanted, which is to give Sophia every possible advantage in the world. And selfishly, maybe it will help me live with myself, knowing that something good came from all those years of regret. End quote. James studied Alexander's face in the dim light from the apartment building's entrance. He saw sincerity there, and pain, and a desperate hope for redemption that resonated with his own fears about failing Sophia. Okay, James said quietly. Let's talk about what kind of help you're offering. Over the next several weeks, Alexander became a regular presence in their lives. He visited every Saturday afternoon, always bringing flowers for their small apartment, and usually some small gift for Sophia, books about science and mathematics that challenged her growing intellect. He never made James feel like a charity case, instead treating their friendship as if it were the natural result of their shared connection to Maria. The changes started small. Alexander arranged for Sophia to be tested for gifted programs at better schools, though he was careful to frame it as expanding her options rather than rejecting her current situation. When the results came back showing that Sophia was reading at a high school level and performing math at a ninth grade standard, even James had to admit that his daughter needed more challenging academic opportunities. "There's a school in the suburbs," Alexander explained during one of their Saturday conversations. "It's a public magnet school for academically gifted students with a focus on science and technology. They provide bus transportation from the city, and there's no tuition." James had heard of the school, had even driven past it once when he'd been working a job in that area. The building was modern and well-maintained, with extensive science labs and computer facilities that his daughter's current school couldn't dream of affording. "What's the catch?" James asked suspiciously. "No catch," Alexander assured him. "It's a competitive admission process, but Sophia's test scores virtually guarantee her acceptance. The only question is whether you're comfortable with her spending 3 hours a day on a bus." That night, James discussed the opportunity with Sophia, explaining about the longer commute and the more challenging academic environment. To his surprise, Sophia was immediately enthusiastic about the prospect. "I want to go," she said firmly. "Mrs. Peterson says I'm bored in my current classes, and I want to learn about real science, not just the basic stuff we do now." "It means you'd have to get up earlier every day," James warned. "And you get home later. We have less time together." "But I'd be learning things that would make Mom proud," Sophia replied with the kind of mature reasoning that constantly amazed her father. "And you always said that education was the most important thing we could invest in." The application process was more complex than anything James had navigated before, requiring essays and recommendations and interviews that made him nervous despite Alexander's assurances that Sophia was an ideal candidate. But Alexander guided them through each step, helping Sophia prepare for her interview and connecting them with current students who could describe what to expect. When the acceptance letter arrived in March, Sophia's excitement was infectious. She danced around their small apartment, already planning what she would study and which advanced classes she wanted to take. James felt a mixture of pride and anxiety, proud of his daughter's accomplishments, but worried about the changes this would bring to their daily routine. "She's going to thrive there," Alexander said when they called to share the news. "Maria always said that smart kids need to be challenged, or they lose their love of learning." As Sophia's first day at the new school approached, James found himself relying more and more on Alexander's guidance. The billionaire seemed to understand the education system in ways that James, with his high school diploma and community college certificate, simply didn't. Alexander helped them choose supplies, explained the different academic tracks available, and even arranged for Sophia to meet with a counselor who specialized in helping gifted students adjust to accelerated DIA programs. "I feel like I'm in over my head," James confided during one of their evening conversations. "Every parent feels that way sometimes," Alexander replied. "The key is surrounding your child with people who can help them succeed. You're doing exactly what Maria would have done." The mention of Maria had become a regular part of their conversations, but rather than being painful, James found it comforting to share memories and hear stories about his wife's younger years. Alexander had a way of bringing Maria's personality to life in his stories, describing her laugh and her stubbornness and her fierce loyalty to the people she cared about. "She used to say that children were like plants," Alexander told Sophia one Saturday afternoon. "They need the right soil and sunlight and water to grow properly. Most kids never get all three, but when they do, they can grow into something amazing." "What kind of plant do you think I am?" Sophia asked with the curiosity that drove most of her questions. Alexander considered this seriously. "I think you're like a redwood tree," he said finally. "Strong roots, reaching toward the sky, capable of growing taller than anyone expects." Sophia beamed at the comparison, and James felt grateful for Alexander's ability to encourage his daughter's confidence without making her feel pressured to live up to impossible expectations. The first day of school at the magnet program was nerve-wracking for both James and Sophia. James took a personal day from work to see her off, watching anxiously as she boarded the bus with students from all over the city. She looked so small among the high schoolers who shared the route to the suburban campus. But when Sophia came home that afternoon, she was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad, They have a real chemistry lab, she gushed. And the math teacher said I might be able to test into calculus by 10th grade. And there's a robotics club that competes in national tournaments. James listened to her enthusiastic description of advanced placement courses and independent study projects, feeling proud and slightly overwhelmed. This was exactly what Maria would have wanted for Sophia, but it was also moving their daughter into a world that James didn't fully understand. "Are you keeping up okay?" he asked, worried that the academic pressure might be too intense. "It's the best thing ever," Sophia assured him. "I'm finally learning things that are actually interesting." As the weeks went by, James watched his daughter flourish in her new environment. Her grades were excellent, her teachers were impressed with her potential, and she made friends with other students who shared her intellectual curiosity. But James also noticed that Sophia was changing in subtle ways, using vocabulary he didn't recognize and referring to concepts that were beyond his own education. "She's growing up," Alexander observed during one of their Saturday visits. "That's what happens when kids are challenged appropriately." "I'm proud of her," James said. "But sometimes I feel like I'm losing her to a world I can't follow her into." "You're not losing her," Alexander said firmly. "You're launching her. There's a difference." The conversation took place in James's kitchen, while Sophia worked on homework that looked more like college coursework than elementary school assignments. James poured coffee for both men and tried to articulate the complex emotions he'd been experiencing. "Maria always handled the academic stuff," he admitted. "She was the one who helped with homework, who understood what the teachers were talking about during parent conferences. I feel like I'm failing Sophia by not being able to help her the way her mother could have." "James, you're giving Sophia something just as important as academic support," Alexander replied. "You're giving her stability, unconditional love, and a strong moral foundation. Those things matter more than being able to help with calculus homework." "But what happens when she starts applying to colleges?" James asked. "What happens when she needs guidance about careers and opportunities that I've never even heard of?" "That's where people like me come in," Alexander said gently. "Not to replace you, but to supplement what you're already providing. Sophia needs different types of support from different people, and there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered genuinely." The conversation was interrupted by Sophia calling from the living room, excited about a science project she was designing. James went to look at her work, trying to follow her explanation of hypotheses and control groups and statistical analysis. He understood maybe half of what she was saying, but her enthusiasm was unmistakable. "This is what your mom dreamed of," he told her, ruffling her hair affectionately. "She always said you were going to be a scientist, or a doctor, or maybe even a teacher like her." "Actually," Sophia said, her expression growing thoughtful, "I think I might want to be an engineer. Mr. Harrison says engineers solve problems that help people, and Mom always said helping people was the most important thing you could do with your life." James felt a familiar pang of loss, wishing Maria could be there to see their daughter's intellectual development and career aspirations. But he also felt grateful that Sophia was growing up with such clear values and strong ambitions. That evening, after Alexander had gone home and Sophia was asleep, James sat at the kitchen table paying bills and trying to balance their budget. The magnet school had eliminated some expenses, since Sophia now ate lunch at school and had access to textbooks and supplies through their programs. But there were new costs too, transportation fees and activity funds, and the kind of clothes that helped Sophia fit in with her more affluent classmates. James had been supplementing his income with additional weekend work, taking on extra cleaning shifts at office buildings and private homes. The $5,000 check from Alexander had helped tremendously, but James was determined not to become dependent on the billionaire's generosity. He wanted to contribute as much as possible to Sophia's opportunities. The phone rang just as James was finishing the monthly calculations, and he was surprised to see Alexander's number on the caller ID. "I hope I'm not calling too late," Alexander said when James answered. "Just paying bills," James replied. "What's on your mind?" "I wanted to talk to you about something," Alexander said, sounding uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's about Sophia's future, but it's also about a business proposition that might interest you." James felt his guard go up immediately. What kind of business proposition? I've been thinking about expanding some of my companies into new markets, Alexander explained. Specifically, I'm interested in facilities management and building services. I need someone to help me understand that industry from the ground up, someone with real experience and integrity. You want to hire me? You want to hire me? James asked, not sure he'd understood correctly. I want to offer you a position as a consultant, Alexander clarified. You'd help me evaluate potential acquisitions, assess management practices, maybe even run one of the companies once we get it established. The salary would be significantly more than what you're making now, and there would be opportunities for advancement. End quote. James was quiet for several minutes, trying to process the offer. Part of him was immediately suspicious, wondering if this was Alexander's way of making him financially dependent. But another part was intrigued by the possibility of using his experience in a more meaningful way. Why me? James asked finally. Because you understand the work from the inside, Alexander replied. Because you have the kind of integrity that's rare in business, and because I need someone I can trust to tell me the truth about operations and personnel. I don't have a business degree, James pointed out. I don't know anything about corporate management or financial analysis. Those things can be learned, Alexander said. Integrity and work ethic can't be taught. Besides, I'd make sure you had access to any training or education you needed. James found himself thinking about the offer long after the conversation ended. It would mean financial security for Sophia's future, opportunities to advance professionally, and the chance to work in partnership with someone he'd grown to respect. But it would also mean accepting a level of help that made him uncomfortable, and potentially changing the fundamental dynamic of his relationship with Alexander. He decided to talk it over with Sophia before making any decisions. Despite her age, she had inherited Maria's practical wisdom and often offered insights that surprised him. It sounds like a good opportunity, Dad, Sophia said, when James explained the offer the next morning over breakfast. And Mr. Grant knows about business, so if he thinks you'd be good at it, maybe you should trust his judgment. But it would mean working for him, James pointed out. That might make our friendship more complicated. Sophia considered this with the same seriousness she brought to her math homework. Mom always said that the best jobs were the ones where you could help people and learn new things at the same time. It sounds like this job would do both. What if it doesn't work out? James asked. What if I'm not good at business management? Then you'll figure out something else, Sophia replied with the confidence that came from never having experienced real failure. But you won't know unless you try. James spent the weekend researching Alexander's companies and thinking about the skills he'd developed in 20 years of maintenance and custodial work. He knew buildings and systems, understood personnel management from the ground up, and had experience dealing with both employees and clients. Maybe those skills would translate to a business environment better than he'd initially thought. On Monday morning, James called Alexander's office and accepted the consulting position. The transition happened more quickly than James had expected. Alexander arranged for him to attend a week-long business management course at a local university, covering basics like financial analysis and strategic planning. James felt out of place among the other students, most of whom had college degrees and corporate experience. But he worked harder than anyone else and gradually began to understand the concepts. You're a natural at this, his instructor told him after a session on operational efficiency. You see problems that others miss, and your solutions are always practical and cost-effective. Alexander had been right about James's potential. His years of hands-on experience gave him insights into building operations that impressed the executives they met with. When they visited potential acquisition targets, James could spot maintenance issues and personnel problems that might not show up in financial reports, but could significantly impact long-term profitability. This building has foundation problems, James told Alexander during their third site visit. See how the floors aren't quite level in the basement, and the way the employees avoid making eye contact with their supervisor. That tells me there are management issues that go beyond what we're seeing in the productivity reports. Alexander hired engineers to assess the foundation, and they confirmed James's suspicions about structural problems that would require expensive repairs. A follow-up investigation into the management situation revealed a pattern of workplace harassment that had led to high turnover and low morale. How did you know? Alexander asked as they drove back to the office. 20 years of working in buildings teaches you things, James replied. You learn to read the signs that most people miss. Within 6 months, James had been promoted from consultant to director of operations for Alexander's facilities management division. The salary increase allowed him to move Sophia and himself into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, closer to Sophia's school, and with enough space for her to have her own room for homework and projects. I can't believe this is our place, Sophia said as they unpacked boxes in their new home. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and windows that actually let in natural light. Your mom would be so proud, James told her, watching Sophia arrange her books on built-in shelves that were a luxury compared to the plastic crates they'd been using before. I think she'd be proud of both of us, Sophia replied. You're really good at your new job, Dad. Mr. Grant says you have the best instincts of anyone he's ever worked with. James felt a warm glow of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money or status. For the first time since Maria's death, he felt like he was moving forward rather than just surviving. Alexander had become such a regular part of their lives that Sophia automatically set 3 places when he joined them for dinner, which happened most Saturday evenings now. The billionaire seemed to enjoy their simple meals and relaxed conversations, often staying late to help Sophia with science projects or to discuss books they'd both read. You know what I realized? Alexander said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. I spent so many years chasing success that I forgot what it felt like to just enjoy spending time with people I care about. Maria used to say that success was measured by relationships, not bank accounts, James replied, loading dishes into the dishwasher of their new apartment. She was right about most things, Alexander said with a smile, including her choice of husband. She would be amazed by what you've accomplished this year. James felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. He was grateful for the opportunities Alexander had provided, but he still missed sharing these victories with Maria. Sometimes he caught himself wanting to call her, to tell her about Sophia's latest academic achievement or his own professional growth. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? James asked. If Maria hadn't gotten sick, if you'd found each other again somehow? Alexander considered the question seriously. I used to wonder about that constantly, he admitted. But now I think everything happened the way it was supposed to. Maria got the life she deserved with someone who appreciated her from the beginning. Sophia got a father who would do anything for her, and maybe, eventually, I got the chance to be part of something meaningful instead of just accumulating wealth. Do you regret not having children of your own? James asked. I used to, Alexander said. But spending time with Sophia has shown me that family isn't just about biology. I love that little girl like she was my own daughter, and I think she's helped heal something in me that I didn't even realize was all broken. As if summoned by their conversation, Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, already in her pajamas but carrying a book about marine biology. Mr. Grant, can you help me understand this chapter about ocean ecosystems? She asked. Dad's really good at math, but you're better at explaining the science parts. Alexander smiled and followed Sophia to the living room, where they settled on the couch with the textbook between them. James listened to their conversation as he finished cleaning the kitchen, marveling at how naturally Alexander had settled into a mentoring role. This was what family looked like, James realized. Not the traditional structure he'd imagined when he and Maria first talked about having children, but something that worked just as well. Sophia had gained a father figure who could guide her intellectual development. Alexander had found a sense of purpose beyond making money, and James had discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed. 6 months later, James received a phone call that would test the strength of their unconventional family arrangement. Alexander's voice was tight with stress when he called late on the Tuesday evening. James, I need to ask you for something, Alexander said without preamble. It's about Sophia, and it's time-sensitive. What's wrong? James asked, immediately alert. I've been offered an opportunity to acquire a company in Singapore, Alexander explained. It's a major expansion that could set up our Asian operations for the next decade, but it would mean spending 6 months overseas, maybe longer. James waited for Alexander to continue, not sure why this affected Sophia. "The thing is," Alexander said, "Sophia's been selected for a summer research program at the State University. It's an incredible opportunity, working with graduate students on real scientific research. But it requires a significant time commitment, and I know you're already stretched thin with your new responsibilities at work." James felt a familiar surge of inadequacy. Despite his professional growth, there were still aspects of Sophia's accelerated development that required more support than he could provide alone. "What are you suggesting?" James asked. "I'm suggesting that I turn down the Singapore opportunity," Alexander replied. "Sophia's education is more important than any business deal. I can send other people to handle the acquisition." The offer was both generous and problematic. James didn't want Alexander to sacrifice major business opportunities for their family, but he also wasn't sure how to manage Sophia's increasingly complex academic needs without help. "Let me think about it," James said finally. "Maybe there's another solution." That night, James lay awake, trying to figure out how to balance everyone's needs. Sophia deserved every opportunity to pursue her academic interests. Alexander had built his companies through smart expansion decisions, and James needed to prove that he could handle increased responsibility without constant support. The solution came to him during his morning commute, and it was both simple and terrifying. "What if Sophia and I came with you to Singapore?" James suggested when he called Alexander the next day. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. "I mean, what if we made it a family trip?" James explained. "Sophia could do an independent study program through her school, work with tutors in Singapore, maybe even audit some university courses there. And I could help you evaluate the acquisition, learn about international operations." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, presumably considering the logistics and implications. "That's a significant commitment," he said finally. 6 months in a foreign country, away from everything familiar. "Sophia's already living in a world that's unfamiliar to me," James pointed out. "At least this way we'd all be figuring it out together." "What does Sophia think about the idea?" Alexander asked. "I haven't mentioned it to her yet," James admitted. "I wanted to see if you thought it was feasible first." "Let me make some phone calls," Alexander said. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right." That evening, James sat Sophia down for one of their serious conversations at the kitchen table. He explained about Alexander's business opportunity and the research program she'd been selected for, presenting the Singapore option as just one of several possibilities. Sophia's reaction surprised him. "We'd all go together?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "If you want to," James confirmed. "It would mean leaving your school, your friends, everything familiar for 6 months. But I'd get to see a completely different part of the world," Sophia said, "and learn about different cultures, maybe study at a real university." "It would be challenging," James warned. "Everything would be new and different." Sophia grinned with an expression that reminded James powerfully of Maria's adventurous spirit. "Mom always said that the best learning happened outside your comfort zone." "So you want to do it?" James asked. "I want us to do it together," Sophia corrected. "Like a real family." The phrase hit James with unexpected force. Sophia had articulated something he'd been feeling, but hadn't been able to express. Over the past year, the three of them had indeed become a real family, bound not by blood or legal obligation, but by choice and mutual care. "Then we'll do it together," James promised. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation. Alexander arranged for James to get additional training in international business practices, while Sophia worked with her teachers to design an independent study curriculum that would keep her on track academically while allowing for cultural immersion. They spent evenings learning basic Mandarin phrases and researching Singapore's history and culture. Alexander had arranged for them to live in a serviced apartment near his temporary offices, with access to international schools and university programs for Sophia. "Are you nervous?" Sophia asked James as they packed for the trip. "Terrified," James admitted, "but also excited. This is the kind of opportunity your mom always dreamed we'd be able to give you." "What about you?" Sophia asked. "What do you think Mom would say about your new career?" James considered the question as he folded clothes into his suitcase. "I think she'd say that helping people discover their potential was the most important work anyone could do, whether it was teaching kids or building companies." The flight to Singapore was Sophia's first time on an airplane, and she spent most of the 16-hour journey pressed against the window, marveling at clouds and oceans and foreign landscapes. Alexander had upgraded them to business class, a luxury that made James uncomfortable until he saw how much Sophia enjoyed having space to spread out her books and projects. "This is amazing," Sophia whispered during their stopover in Tokyo, staring wide-eyed at the bustling international airport. "It's just the beginning," Alexander promised. "Wait until you see Singapore." Singapore exceeded even Alexander's promises. The city was a fascinating blend of ultramodern architecture and traditional culture, with incredible diversity in food, language, and customs. Their apartment overlooked Marina Bay, with a view of the skyline that took Sophia's breath away every morning. "I feel like I'm living in the future," she told James as they explored their new neighborhood. James felt the same way. The efficiency of the transportation system, the cleanliness of the streets, the seamless integration of technology into daily life, all of it was unlike anything he'd experienced. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, he found himself analyzing systems and operations with the same curiosity that had made him successful in his new career. "You're seeing this with management eyes now," Alexander observed as they walked through a shopping district. "6 months ago, you would have just been impressed by the spectacle. Now you're thinking about how it all works." Alexander was right. James found himself noticing staffing patterns and maintenance schedules, thinking about the logistics required to keep such a complex city running smoothly. The skills he developed over the past year were allowing him to understand Singapore in ways he wouldn't have been able to appreciate before. Sophia thrived in their new environment. Alexander had arranged for her to audit courses at the National University of Singapore while continuing her independent study curriculum. She made friends with other international students and threw herself into learning about Southeast Asian culture and history. "Dad, did you know that Singapore has 4 official languages?" she announced over dinner one evening. "I'm going to try to learn some Tamil while we're here." "That's ambitious," James said, proud of his daughter's intellectual curiosity. "Mom always said that learning new languages was like unlocking secret doors in your mind," Sophia replied. "I want to unlock as many doors as possible." James's own work in Singapore proved to be as educational as Sophia's studies. The company Alexander was acquiring operated differently from American businesses, with cultural considerations and regulatory requirements that challenged James to think beyond his previous experience. "You're adapting faster than I expected," Alexander told him after a particularly successful negotiation meeting. "You have a natural feel for reading people and situations that works regardless of cultural context." "I think it comes from all those years working with people from different backgrounds," James replied. "When you're cleaning office buildings, you interact with everyone from CEOs to security guards. You learn that people are pretty much the same everywhere, they just express it differently." The insight proved valuable as James helped Alexander navigate the complex process of international acquisition. His ability to connect with employees at all levels of the organization provided information that formal reports couldn't capture. 3 months into their Singapore experience, James received unexpected news that put their future plans in perspective. Alexander called him into his temporary office, with an expression James had learned to associate with important conversations. "I've been offered a position," Alexander said without preamble. "The Singapore government wants me to head up a new initiative for sustainable urban development. It would mean establishing permanent operations here, becoming part of their long-term planning process." James felt a familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is," Alexander agreed. "But it would also mean making Singapore our home base, not just a temporary assignment. It would mean major changes for all of us." "What kind of changes?" James asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "I'd want you to run the Southeast Asian operations," Alexander explained. "It would mean a significant promotion, a substantial salary increase, and the chance to be part of something really innovative." but it would also mean leaving the United States permanently, or at least for several years. James sat quietly, trying to process the implications. On one hand, it was the kind of opportunity he'd never imagined possible 2 years ago. On the other hand, it meant completely uprooting the life he and Sophia had built, leaving behind everything familiar and starting over in a foreign country. "What does Sophia think?" James asked. "I haven't mentioned it to her yet," Alexander replied. "I wanted to discuss it with you first, get your initial reaction." "My initial reaction is that it sounds both amazing and terrifying," James admitted. "But ultimately, it has to be Sophia's decision too. This is her life we're talking about." That evening, the three of them sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sun set over Marina Bay, while James and Alexander explained the opportunity. Sophia listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about education systems and cultural integration. "Would we become Singapore citizens?" she asked. "Eventually, if we wanted to," Alexander replied. "But you'd always be able to return to the United States whenever you chose." "What about visiting Mom's grave?" Sophia asked quietly. The question hit James hard. They'd established a tradition of visiting Maria's grave on her birthday and the anniversary of her death, and the thought of being unable to maintain that connection was painful. "We could visit several times a year," Alexander assured her. "And maybe eventually, we could arrange to have your mother moved here, if that felt right to you." Sophia was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the lights beginning to twinkle across the city skyline. Finally, she turned to face both men. "I want to do it," she said firmly. "Mom always talked about how important it was to embrace opportunities, even when they were scary. This feels like the kind of opportunity she would want us to take." "Are you sure?" James asked. "It's a big decision, sweetheart. Once we make this choice, it will be hard to go back." "I'm sure," Sophia replied. "We become a family here, the three of us. And we're all learning and growing in ways that wouldn't have been possible if we'd stayed home. Mom would want us to keep growing." James felt a surge of pride in his daughter's maturity and wisdom. At 9 years old, she was making decisions with the kind of thoughtful consideration that many adults couldn't manage. "Then we'll do it," James said, reaching over to squeeze both Sophia's hand and Alexander's. "We'll make Singapore our new home." The decision, once made, brought a sense of rightness that surprised James with its intensity. As they began making plans for permanent relocation, he realized that Maria's influence on their lives hadn't diminished with time, it had simply evolved. She had given them the foundation of values and love that made this new adventure possible. 6 months later, James stood in the offices of Grant Industries Southeast Asia, looking out at the bustling harbor while reviewing quarterly reports from their expanding operations. Sophia was at the International School of Singapore, thriving in an environment that challenged her academically while exposing her to classmates from dozens of different countries. Alexander knocked on his office door and entered with the kind of satisfied expression he wore when business was going particularly well. "The Sustainable Development Project just got approved for full funding," he announced. "We're going to be building the city of the future, and you're going to be running operations for the whole thing." James smiled, thinking about how much his life had changed since the night he found a wallet in a parking garage. "Maria would be amazed," he said. "She'd be proud," Alexander corrected. "Of both of us, but especially of you. You've become the kind of man she always believed you could be." That evening, the three of them had dinner at their favorite restaurant overlooking the Singapore River, celebrating Alexander's new project, and planning their summer vacation to visit Maria's grave and see old friends in the Cebu, United States. "I have something to tell you both," Sophia announced as they finished their meal. James and Alexander looked at her expectantly, recognizing the serious tone she used for important conversations. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately," Sophia continued. "And I realized something. She didn't just give me life, she gave me both of you too. Dad, she chose you because she knew you'd be the perfect father for me. And Mr. Grant, she knew you 20 years ago, but maybe she knew that someday you'd come back into our lives when we needed you most." Sophia paused, looking between the two men who had become her family. "I think Mom planned all of this somehow," she said with the kind of certainty that only children can possess. "I think she knew that losing the wallet would bring us all together and that we'd become a real family." James felt tears prick his eyes as he considered his daughter's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe Maria's love had somehow orchestrated the events that brought them together. Or maybe they'd simply been lucky enough to find each other when they all needed family most. "I think you might be right," Alexander said softly. "Your mother always was smarter than the rest of us." As they walked home through the warm Singapore evening, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 2 years ago, he'd been a struggling single father, working multiple jobs just to keep up with basic expenses. Now he was a successful international business executive, living in one of the world's most dynamic cities, with a daughter who was poised to accomplish anything she set her mind to, and a partner who had become the brother he'd never had. The wallet had been just the beginning. What followed was a testament to the power of honesty, the importance of family, and the way love could create connections that transcended traditional boundaries. Maria's influence lived on in every decision they made, every value they embraced, and every opportunity they chose to pursue together. Sophia skipped ahead of them on the sidewalk, chattering excitedly about a science project she was planning and the university courses she wanted to audit next semester. She was growing into exactly the kind of person Maria had dreamed she could become, confident and curious, and committed to using her talents to help others. "Thank you," James said to Alexander, as they watched Sophia's animated conversation with a street vendor who was teaching her phrases in Tamil. "For what?" Alexander asked. "For giving us this life," James replied. "For seeing Maria's potential in Sophia and making sure she has every opportunity to reach it." "Thank you for trusting me with your family," Alexander countered. "For letting me be part of something more important than any business deal I could ever make." They stood there for a moment. Two men who had found their way to an unexpected friendship through love for the same woman and commitment to the same child. Around them, Singapore pulsed with energy and possibility, a city that had welcomed them and offered them chances they'd never imagined. As they caught up with Sophia and continued their walk home, James thought about the photograph that had started everything, the faded picture of a young Maria that Alexander still carried in his wallet. That image had been the key that unlocked their shared history and opened the door to their shared future. Now they were writing a new story together, one that honored Maria's memory while creating opportunities she would never have dreamed possible. It was a story about the transformative power of honesty, the resilience of love, and the way family could be built through choice rather than chance. Sophia ran back to join them, linking arms with both men as they approached their apartment building. In her gesture, James saw the completion of a circle that had begun 20 years ago when Alexander first met Maria, had continued through James's marriage and Sophia's birth, and had found its perfect resolution in the moment a janitor chose to return a lost wallet to its rightful owner. Some stories ended with traditional happy endings, but theirs was better than that. Theirs was a story that continued growing, creating new possibilities with each passing day, proving that families could be built on foundations of trust, honesty, and shared purpose, rather than just blood relations. As they reached their apartment building, James looked up at the windows of their home, glowing warmly against the Singapore skyline. Inside were photographs of Maria alongside pictures of their new adventures, Sophia's science projects spread across the dining table, and 3 coffee mugs that had become a symbol of their morning routine together. It had all started with a simple choice: to return a lost wallet. But that choice had unlocked a chain of events that transformed 3 lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Maria's love lived on in the family they had created, in the opportunities Sophia was embracing, and in the second chances that proved it was never too late to choose what mattered most. The photograph in Alexander's wallet had revealed the past, but it was their shared commitment to Sophia's future that had created something entirely new. They weren't trying to recreate what was lost. They were building something that honored what came before, while reaching toward possibilities that none of them could have imagined alone. As they rode the elevator up to their home, Sophia chattering about tomorrow's plans and next week's adventures, James felt a deep sense of peace. Maria would have loved seeing their daughter so confident and curious, would have been amazed by the opportunities that lay ahead, and would have been proud of the family they had all chosen to become together.